They ridiculed America as feeble, laughed that its warriors survived on nothing but sweets and caffeine, sneered that its citizens were far too pampered to endure genuine combat. But when captured, German soldiers were transported across an entire ocean and gathered for their very first meals inside American prison camps. The mockery died in their throats. What greeted them on those plates wasn't vulnerability. It was a power so overwhelming. It could nourish even those who'd sworn to destroy it. The weapon of words and lies. Inside Nazi Germany, sustenance became far more than survival. The regime weaponized it, twisted it into propaganda. They fed their troops the identical narrative again and again and again. America was fragile, its population spoiled beyond repair, its fighting men hopelessly addicted to comfort, and its industrial might nothing but glorified candy factories. Radio broadcasts screamed that American forces couldn't function without chewing gum, chocolate bars, and bottles of Coca-Cola. Printed headlines insisted that without their precious canned peaches and morning coffee, the Yankees would crumble within days on any battlefield. Down in the muddy trenches, these tales transformed into cruel comedy. Huddled around flickering fires inside frozen concrete bunkers, German infantrymen openly ridiculed their transatlantic enemies as pathetically weak. They boasted proudly. While they endured dense black bread, thin cabbage broth, and watery excuses for beer, the Americans supposedly demanded porterhouse steaks and sugar-laden treats just to survive another day. Every photograph showing grinning GIs casually holding cigarettes and candy only amplified their contempt. To the German soldier, food revealed true character. They genuinely believed hardship forged unbreakable iron will, while prosperity bred nothing but softness and decay. By mocking American field rations, they weren't merely insulting enemy stomachs. They were desperately protecting their own wounded pride, because it was infinitely easier to laugh at abundance than to acknowledge the terrifying reality staring them down. An adversary that was simultaneously well-fed and heavily armed might prove utterly unconquerable when capture stripped away the bravado. But when the moment of surrender finally arrived, that cocky confidence faced its first brutal test. Across the scorching deserts of North Africa, through the ancient hills of Italy, and later throughout the French countryside, tens of thousands of German troops laid down their weapons before Allied forces. Stripped of rifles and dignity alike, herded into hastily erected barbed wire enclosures, they began whispering nervously about what horrors awaited them across the sea. The very propaganda they'd once found so amusing now twisted violently into bone-deep fear. Dark rumors spread like wildfire through the holding pens. Some swore prisoners would face deliberate starvation as punishment. Others claimed they'd receive only rotten scraps, treated with less dignity than farm animals. A handful whispered even more sinister possibilities: forced labor deep in coal mines until their bodies gave out, or quiet executions in remote locations where no witnesses could tell the tale. During the seemingly endless voyage across the cold Atlantic, that mask of arrogance briefly returned. Prisoners filled the oppressive silence with bitter attempts at humor, loudly insisting the Americans would bungle everything, that whatever food appeared would be completely inedible. "Let's witness how these pampered Yankees attempt to feed actual soldiers," they jeered, voices deliberately loud enough for their guards to overhear. But beneath those sneers lurked genuine unease. Crammed together in those dim cargo holds, every distant clang of cooking pots from the ship's galley, every faint aroma of food preparation drifting downward, served as a haunting reminder of the unknown fate rushing toward them. Not a single man truly believed what awaited was mercy. They steeled themselves for brutality. They prepared for gnawing starvation. They braced for systematic humiliation. Yet the instant their boots touched American earth, everything they'd been conditioned to believe would shatter completely. Their first genuine taste of America would not be deprivation, but staggering abundance. First glimpse of an unstoppable machine. When those German prisoners finally completed their Atlantic crossing, their initial view of America left them utterly speechless. They'd anticipated a struggling, disorganized wasteland. Instead, they bore massive transport ships glided into harbors lined with colossal industrial cranes, seemingly infinite rows of military trucks, and sprawling factory complexes that stretched beyond the horizon. The dockside practically vibrated with relentless activity. Freight trains rattling endlessly along countless tracks, dock workers unloading cargo with mechanical efficiency and breathtaking speed. The heavy scent of machine oil and molten steel hanging thick in the humid air. For countless Germans, this marked their very first glimpse of America, and it matched absolutely nothing their propaganda masters had described. There were no starving crowds begging for bread, no chaotic scenes of national collapse. Instead, they witnessed a nation practically overflowing with raw energy and industrial precision. As guards marched them toward waiting trains, they couldn't help noticing the passenger and freight cars stretching farther than most had ever witnessed throughout all of Europe combined. Through those barred windows, an entirely foreign landscape flew past at startling speed. Remarkably fertile farmland, impeccably maintained towns, multi-lane highways packed with private automobiles, factory after factory with smokestacks pumping continuous columns of smoke into endless blue sky. The silence among the prisoners grew increasingly heavy and uncomfortable. Some whispered to each other in genuine disbelief. Others kept troubling thoughts carefully buried. Unwilling to openly admit what their own eyes were screaming at them, the mocking laughter that had once flowed so effortlessly was rapidly fading, replaced by a deeply unsettling awareness they couldn't quite shake. This wasn't weakness or decay. This was something entirely different, something far more dangerous. The meal that changed everything. Still, the prisoners desperately clung to one final expectation. Surely the food would expose the hidden truth behind America's facade. Marched through camp gates surrounded by coiled barbed wire and imposing watchtowers, they mentally prepared themselves for watery soup and rock-hard bread. Instead, they were escorted into surprisingly orderly mess halls, and the rich aroma of actual cooking filled their nostrils immediately. Sturdy wooden tables arranged in precise rows, and from those steaming kitchens emerged plates piled higher than any of them had dared imagine possible. Bread, genuinely fresh and soft to the touch. Real meat, actual vegetables, sometimes even mashed potatoes swimming in rich brown gravy. On certain days, there was coffee, authentic coffee, a luxury most Germans hadn't experienced in multiple years. For men who'd grown painfully accustomed to constant hunger at the Eastern Front, this was nothing less than absolutely shocking. That first meal rendered them completely silent. Metal forks clinked softly, tin spoons scraped against plates, but virtually no words were spoken aloud. The food wasn't merely plentiful, it was genuinely delicious. Some prisoners muttered darkly bitter jokes, acknowledging they were eating significantly better as captives than their own wives and children back in the fatherland. Others simply stared down at their overflowing plates in stunned disbelief, before mechanically consuming every single bite. What they had feared as deliberate punishment revealed itself instead as an incomprehensible form of generosity. And during that transformative first meal, many silently realized something they could never dare speak. Aloud, America possessed strength enough to feed even those sworn to its destruction. The herdy routine that broke their reality. That first shocking meal caught them off guard, but what truly demolished their fundamental expectations was the relentless routine, day after day after day. The food simply kept arriving. This wasn't some isolated generous gesture designed to confuse them. This was an established system functioning with mechanical precision. Breakfast routinely included fresh bread with real butter or fruit preserves, sometimes scrambled eggs, hot oatmeal, or even crispy bacon strips when supply chains allowed. For men conditioned to beginning their mornings with nothing beyond crusts of dense black bread and bitter coffee substitutes, it felt completely surreal. Midday brought hearty stews packed with beans, green peas, or tender lentils, often with genuine chunks of beef or pork mixed throughout. Evening dinner might deliver roast beef, thick pork chops, or roasted chicken accompanied by potatoes, savory gravy, and multiple varieties of vegetables. And on Sundays or recognized holidays, many camps even served proper dessert, apple pies, vanilla puddings, or canned fruit that tasted almost sinfully luxurious. But the true revelation was coffee. Back in Germany, real coffee had become a distant, fading memory. Desperate families stretched microscopic rations by mixing in roasted acorns or ground barley. But here, in captivity behind enemy wire, steaming mugs of genuine coffee were distributed daily without question. For many POWs, that rich, intoxicating aroma wafting through the mess hall proved more psychologically shocking than the sight of armed guards with loaded rifles. The physical transformation became undeniable. Soldiers who'd staggered into captivity, gaunt and hollow-cheeked, began visibly gaining healthy weight. Their uniforms, once fitting snugly during months at the front lines, gradually started loosening as their frames naturally filled back out. American medical officers documented this irony with characteristically dry humor in official reports. These prisoners of war were frequently healthier during captivity than they'd been while actively serving the Third Reich. It certainly wasn't gourmet cuisine, but compared to the devastating hunger consuming all of Europe, it was pure abundance. And within that abundance, these German soldiers began recognizing something their leaders had deliberately concealed. America's true strength wasn't measured exclusively in weapons production and military machinery, but in its seemingly effortless ability to feed millions upon millions, even its sworn enemies, without any apparent strain whatsoever. When food became questions. The steady meals stirred something far deeper than mere physical hunger. They awakened forbidden questions. Initially, many prisoners attempted to laugh it away defensively. Inside the wooden barracks, after lights out, they joked bitterly, claiming the Americans were deliberately fattening them like livestock before eventual slaughter. Others whispered conspiratorially that everything was psychological warfare. Provide the enemy with comfort and plenty to systematically break his fighting spirit and will to resist. But with every single passing day, the routine never wavered even slightly. The plates remained consistently full, the scheduled meals arriving like clockwork, the coffee perpetually hot and fresh. For some prisoners, the irony became genuinely painful to contemplate. Letters from home painted an increasingly bleak picture. Devoted wives standing in impossibly long queues for rationed bread, young children going entire months without tasting meat, whole families surviving on turnips and ersatz coffee that barely resembled the real thing. And here, behind barbed wire as defeated enemies, German soldiers were being served more food than they could physically finish at a single sitting. Some wrote home carrying deep shame, others with crushing guilt weighing on their conscience, and a notable few never mentioned the food situation at all, terrified their starving families would grow to resent them for it. Among the prisoner population, heated arguments frequently erupted. Hardcore committed Nazis insisted loudly that American abundance was actually profound weakness. that such luxury would inevitably rot the human spirit from within. But an increasing number quietly admitted the opposite truth. After all, what kind of nation could simultaneously feed millions of its own citizens, wage a devastating world war across 2 entire continents, and still feed its captured enemies with regular, substantial meals? The carefree laughter that once filled the transport ships crossing the Atlantic had vanished completely. In its place settled a heavy, contemplative silence, punctuated only by the metallic scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Each meal gradually became less about merely filling empty stomachs, and more about systematically chipping away at the propaganda they'd once accepted as absolute truth. To continue mocking America now seemed embarrassingly foolish. To openly admire it felt dangerously subversive, and yet, with every single bite, admiration grew all the same. Letters from a Starving Homeland. The longer these prisoners remained on American soil, the more impossible it became to ignore the devastating contrast with home. Letters trickled in sporadically from Germany, and virtually every single one told the identical heartbreaking story: severe shortages, restrictive ration cards, and relentless hunger. Families wrote in careful, measured words about standing for multiple hours in lines that snaked around entire city blocks, just to purchase meager amounts of bread or potatoes. Meat had become extraordinarily rare. Butter and sugar existed only as fading memories of better times. Coffee, once an everyday staple of German life, had all but completely disappeared from civilian access, replaced by increasingly bitter substitutes manufactured from roasted barley or ground acorns. Some POWs kept these precious letters folded tightly in their uniform pockets, reading them again and again until the paper developed permanent creases and the ink began to fade. And each time they walked into that camp mess hall, with its unmistakable smell of baking bread, its loaded trays of meat and fresh vegetables, its steaming mugs of authentic coffee, the difference between the world inside the wire and the world they'd left behind became absolutely impossible to deny or rationalize away. The irony cut deep into their souls. Men who had proudly marched off to fight for the glory of the Reich now sat at long wooden tables, eating significantly better than their own devoted wives and innocent children back home. Some felt overwhelming shame. Others carried crushing guilt, and a few even stopped writing about food altogether in their letters, afraid that honesty would inflict unbearable wounds on the people they loved most desperately in this world. It transcended mere meals anymore. It was about what those meals fundamentally represented. In Germany, the insatiable war machine had systematically consumed everything in its path: food, fuel, hope, even the future itself. In America, abundance seemed genuinely endless and inexhaustible. The prisoners gradually realized that the rations appearing on their plates weren't desperate scraps from a system on the verge of collapse, but simply the natural overflow of a nation strong enough to simultaneously fight a global war and still feed millions without breaking stride. Every single bite served as an unavoidable reminder they couldn't escape. Nazi propaganda had been nothing but elaborate lies from the very beginning. The silent lesson of abundance. Over time, food evolved into something far greater than survival. It became an education. At first, the Germans had laughed dismissively at American rations, sneering that steak and chocolate would inevitably make soldiers weak and soft. But inside these camps, with every orderly meal, with every steaming mug of genuine coffee, they witnessed that abundance was not weakness at all. It was pure, undeniable power. The Americans didn't need to starve their enemies to demonstrate their strength. They possessed confidence enough to feed them properly. That quiet, understated confidence proved disarming in ways cruelty could never hope to achieve. Around the barracks during evening hours, conversations gradually shifted in tone. Some prisoners still clung desperately to Nazi ideology, declaring loudly that German discipline and willpower would ultimately outlast American comfort and material excess. But many others began genuinely wondering, if a nation could treat its captives with this remarkable level of organization and basic humanity, what else might it be truly capable of achieving? For some, that troubling thought lingered long after the war finally ended. They returned home carrying vivid stories of steaming camp kitchens, spotlessly clean mess halls, and the strange, disorienting reality of eating better in captivity than they had in so-called freedom. A notable few never returned home at all, choosing instead to remain permanently in the very country they had once so cruelly mocked. The propaganda had told them America was weak, hopelessly divided, and doomed to inevitable collapse. But the reality appearing on their plates told an entirely different story. A nation so profoundly strong it could win a world war on multiple fronts, and still set a prisoner's table with fresh bread, real meat, and genuine coffee. In the end, the laughter died away completely. What had begun as contemptuous mockery ended as reluctant, undeniable admiration. And for thousands upon thousands of German soldiers, the true taste of America was not bitterness or deprivation, but shocking, overwhelming abundance. The final truth. In the end, those German prisoners discovered that America's greatest weapon was never just its factories or its armies. It was abundance itself. They had expected systematic cruelty, deliberate starvation, and calculated humiliation. Instead, they found clean barracks, steady meals arriving like clockwork, and even a strange, unexpected kind of humanity they'd been told didn't exist in their enemy. For many, it marked their first genuine taste of freedom from constant fear. A freedom served not with propaganda posters and empty promises, but with bread, meat, and coffee. Some carried that powerful memory back to a devastated Germany, telling their families in hushed, careful tones about the surprising kindness of their American captors. Others chose never to leave, building entirely new lives in the very country they had once ridiculed as weak and doomed. The lesson was unmistakably clear. True strength is never proven by starving your enemies, but by possessing the power to feed them without hesitation. And, for thousands of German soldiers who experienced it firsthand, the real face of America was not weakness or decay. It was confidence, prosperity, and the quiet certainty of a nation strong enough to win with both overwhelming power and unexpected mercy.